This is Dr. Karen, and you are listening to the Facto Leaders podcast on the B Podcast Network, where I share up-to-date, evidence-based practices, my own experiences, and guest interviews designed to help pediatric therapists, educators, and aspiring school leaders design services that support social, emotional, and academic growth and set kids up for success in adulthood. Whether you want to learn effective strategies for your therapy session or classroom, be an influential leader on your team, or find creative ways to use your skills to advance in your career, I've got you covered.
Hey everyone, it's Dr. Karen, and welcome to episode 177 of the De Facto Leaders podcast on the B Podcast Network. This episode is the second episode in the Reading is Fundamental series. This is part of a partnership that De Facto Leaders is doing because we are part of the B Podcast Network. We are partnering with Reading is Fundamental in the month of September to support evidence-based literacy instruction and to address book equity issues. As part of this effort, I will be publishing some extra episodes, so I will be publishing 2 episodes per week relating to literacy in the month of September, and then in October, I will resume my normal schedule of publishing once a week. Reading is Fundamental is a nonprofit that focuses on connecting educators and families with materials and training aligned with evidence-based literacy instruction. Not only is their model aligned with the science of reading, they also offer unique book ownership solutions for professionals and families. And you can learn more about Reading is Fundamental by taking a look at the links in the show notes. To celebrate this special series, I am giving my listeners 25% off of their tuition when they join either Language Therapy Advanced Foundations or the School of Clinical Leadership between September 15th and October 15th. Language Therapy Advanced Foundations is my program that helps SLPs and other professionals working on language develop a framework for language therapy. To learn more about that program, you can go to drkarenspeech.com/language therapy. And the School of Clinical Leadership is my program that helps related service providers put executive functioning programming and supports in place in their buildings. To learn more about that program, you can go to drkarendudek-Brannan.com/clinical leadership. And to get access to the special rate between September 15th and October 15th, all you need to do is enter coupon code RIF25 on the checkout page when you sign up. Now let's get to the episode. In this episode, I discuss reading myths and common literacy buzzwords with Anna Geiger from The Measured Mom. There are many science of reading terms being used right now, including the science of reading itself. Yet debates about how to help kids become literate continues, and part of that is because of common logical fallacies often applied to education. So that's why I invited Anna Geiger to this episode to define some of those important literacy terms and discuss myths associated with teaching reading and supporting literacy. Anna Geiger is a former teacher, mom of 6, and the founder and owner of The Measured Mom, host of the Triple R Teaching Podcast, and author of books such as Reach All Readers. She was a balanced literacy advocate for 20 years. As both a classroom teacher and a teacher educator, she promoted 3Qing using leveled texts. She taught phonics but didn't use a scope and sequence, and provided very little direct instruction because she was sure it would bore students. Fast forward to 2019, when she began to realize that many of her teaching practices weren't backed by research. That was when Anna became Orton Gillingham certified and earned a Science of Reading graduate certificate. She currently runs the Measured Mom website, which includes easy prep resources that students will love. In this conversation, we discuss the difference between balanced literacy and structured literacy, decodable texts versus predictable texts, what is 3Qing and why does it encourage poor reading habits, using syntactic and context clues, necessary but not sufficient for decoding, early literacy instruction, and a discussion about play-based learning versus playful learning. And we also discuss finding the joy in teaching and reading and ponder the question, can you find joy in something if you haven't been given the skills to do it? Definitely check the show notes because during this conversation, Anna shares many great resources, and I've linked to all of them in the show notes. So you'll definitely want to check out all of the resources that she mentions, as well as look at the show notes to find out where you can go to buy her new book, Reach All Readers, and learn more about the Measured Mom and Triple R Teaching Podcast, and also to listen to my interview with Anna on Triple R Teaching. Now, please enjoy this interview with Anna Geiger. Today, I am joined by Anna Geiger from The Measured Mom. So thank you so much for being here with me today.
Thanks so much, Karen.
So why don't you start off where we normally start? Tell us a little bit about yourself. Like, what's your history and background leading up to what you're doing now?
Yeah, so I was a classroom teacher, primarily first and second grade. And then when my children started arriving, then I left the classroom and stayed home with them. And about 5 years into that, I began my website, The Measured Mom. At the time, I had a 5-year-old little girl and she had 3 little brothers, and it was pretty overwhelming. And so I was working hard to be more patient, more measured. So I called it The Measured Mom, really as an inspiration to myself to work hard at those things. But I thought it would be a parenting website, but very quickly it became a teaching website. And so now it's 11 years in now. It provides resources for pre-K through third grade educators. And then I was very much a balanced literacy teacher, and we can talk later about what that means. But then around 2019 or so, I began to understand that many things I thought were true about teaching reading were not. So I spent a lot of time looking into that, studying it, and now I really advocate for a structured approach aligned with the science of reading. And I have a podcast called Triple R Teaching. That stands for Reflect, Refine, Recharge. And I interview many experts and teachers who are experts in their own way, of course, about teaching literacy. And then also, I just finished a book, which just came out as you and I are talking like a week ago or less, called Reach All Readers. And that is for primarily K through third grade teachers, parents, administrators who want to learn how to apply the research to teaching well.
Great. So it's funny that you said you started off in the parenting space and it slowly became a resource for professionals, because I had in my podcast, not necessarily the business, but I did the same thing. I thought I'm going to branch out and go and do some things for parents. And then I realized all the people that were asking me questions were professionals, and I do get parents, but yeah, it happened like that for me as well. And then also it's interesting. I'm thinking about the title of your book, Reach All Readers. So can you tell us a little bit about what's behind that title and what that means?
Yeah. So when I was a balanced literacy teacher, which is a way of teaching reading that is not particularly systematic, it feels good, but it's based on some faulty ideas of how reading works. I didn't understand that I was leaving kids behind. And most of my kids were learning to read okay, but I didn't realize that the kids I wasn't helping, it was not because something was wrong with them, it was something wrong with my teaching approach. And so when we use the science of reading and systems to help us, identify children who are still struggling and then work with other staff to fill in those gaps, then we really can reach all readers.
Yeah, and I think that's really what you just said there, how it feels good.
Mm-hmm.
And I see the feel good approaches being promoted in a lot of ways. I would say in the parenting space, that happens a lot, where in the short term, something feels good because it seems, I don't know, almost more fun, easier in the short term, because I don't know, it's maybe requires less work up front. So I see that in a lot of ways. I would say in parenting, it comes up a lot because sometimes you have to have your kids do things that they don't want to do because you know that in the long run, they're going to be more independent and successful and learn skills that are going to help them feel confident. And so that we could go a lot of different directions with that, but it certainly applies to reading, and I see it creeping into reading, especially just because of the science of reading, big air quotes. I know it's the science of reading, capital S, because it's this growing body of research that where there's old research that continues to hold up, but now we know more. So I think maybe a good place to go would be what is balanced literacy versus structured literacy. And I know that the science of reading is just this huge this
Mhm.
this huge term that means a lot of things. So let's start with balanced literacy versus structured literacy.
Yeah. So first of all, and I've shown and anyone who's listening who's familiar with balanced literacy knows that there are a million definitions. It's very difficult to pin down. One teacher's balanced literacy classroom could look very different from a teacher down the hall. But in general, a really important thing to remember is that balanced literacy rests on the theory of three cueing, which has been disproven by research, but was held dear by me and many others for many years. And it's this idea that proficient readers use three cues to help them identify words. They use the meaning, as in context, they use the syntax, the grammar cues, and they use the visual cue of phonics, but that's kind of underneath, like that's the last resort. We're not necessarily looking at all the letters, we're just kind of sampling, and that's how we're reading, because it looks like that's how we're reading. But unfortunately, that idea has led to teaching practices that are also bad, where, for example, beginning readers are taught to read with a predictable book, like I see a cat, I see a dog, I see a fish, I see a guinea pig. So, like they're in a pet store. And the idea is that they memorize that pattern and then they can figure out that final word using context, using syntax, and a little bit of phonics, right? Because a beginning reader can't read guinea pig, but they might know what one is. And if they see the picture and the first letter, g, they can figure that out. So that's how I taught reading. I mean, of course, I did teach more phonics, but not in a systematic way. And a lot of balanced literacy teachers, they do teach some phonics, but the problem, even if they have a good phonics program, which is true in some cases, the application piece is not there because over here they're teaching phonics, but then over here the kids are having this reading material that doesn't allow them to apply the phonics they've learned. Instead, they have to resort to these cues like guess using the picture or memorize the pattern. There's some other big differences. I would say with balanced literacy, there's less of teacher knowledge about all the structures of language. That's something that you're big into. But like as a teacher, I didn't really know. I mean, I was a good student, I was a good writer, a good reader, but I didn't really think a whole lot about syntax and how to communicate that to my students. I didn't really think about how to break down longer words into their syllables. It was more like, well, we'll just kind of find parts we know and just figure it out. There wasn't a lot of um, deep understanding on my part of how language works and how I could teach that to my students. Also, another big one is the idea of progress. So, within a structured literacy classroom, when teachers understand that there are certain early literacy skills we want our students to master, we give them a universal screener. And then based on that, we adjust our instruction. And that universal screener is going to measure essential early literacy skills like phonemic awareness and decoding and letter sounds. Whereas with balanced literacy classrooms, the assessment tool is often something that's actually not all that useful, because a good research-based screener like Acadians or Dibbles 8 is going to actually predict how well the kids are going to do as a reader, and it really shows us what to do to help them. But with an assessment kit like Fountas and Pinnell benchmark assessment system, which is what a lot of schools use that are more balanced literacy, all it does is it figures out supposedly what reading level they're at. And I used benchmark assessment system at my kids' school as a volunteer. They've switched now to Acadians, but I was excited when they got it. I was like, oh, great. Now we're doing some kind of real assessment. But I didn't understand at the time that those reading levels are arbitrary, and especially the early ones, because really the only thing the benchmark assessment system is doing is measuring how good they are at using three cueing, which is not what we want them to do at all. So the reading material is another big one. In balanced literacy, they're working through leveled books. You're trying to use running records to see, when they move to the next level. Whereas with structured literacy, we start them off in decodable text that allows them to practice the skills they've been taught, and then we gradually move them out of that into more authentic literature. So there's more things, but to me, those are the biggest ones and the biggest problems.
Yeah, so I have used the Fontes and Pinnell, like, or at least that was what was used in some of the places where I was. And then in some of my programs for SLPs, I have said, here's an example of what you could put in your progress assessment. And now I've gone back and had to give more context to that, because chances are people could be in a district where that's what they use. And as a related service provider, you only have so much control over what curriculum is being used. So sometimes I'm like, well, you can still put it in there, but you need to put more information about the language skills, the reading skills, how well they're able to, and there's other things that they could put in there. But so I'm like, well, you can still put it, but understand that anytime you're putting certain information in a progress report, that you have to give more context, especially if you know that the assessment is limited. So yeah, there's a lot of places I can go with all the things that you just said. I can think of a number of different questions, but so one thing that I wanted to go into a little bit is, so the idea that you start with decodable text and then you go to more authentic literature. There's this idea that in order for people to be successful, proficient readers and become lifelong readers, and people who just decide to read a book for fun, that we have to bring back the joy. And that's a common message that I have heard. Like, we're focused too much on phonics and it's boring and kids don't like it. And so we need to bring the joy back and expose them to books that are interesting to them, which all good things. But yeah, like, I want to talk about the phonics thing, but let's talk about that transition from decodable to more authentic first, and what's behind that strategy or that sequence.
Sure. Do you want me to talk first about like the joy of reading, or should we save that?
Let's talk about the decodable to authentic, and then let's talk about the joy, and then we'll come back to phonics.
Okay. So I think there isn't, I know teachers really want this, and I totally understand, like a hard and fast rule when kids are moving out of decodable text into more authentic literature. And I should maybe just define some things real quick. Decodable text is decodable for the child, right? So there might be a decodable text that a second grader is reading and during their phonics lessons, but it's decodable for them because they've been taught the patterns in the book. And so a beginning first grader, that's not going to be decodable for them. But decodable books are written to highlight particular phonics patterns. That's why there's decodable book series. For you and me, almost every book we read is decodable, unless we're reading a complicated medical journal or something that we don't know much about. But for kids, it's decodable based on what they've been taught. So the reason we do use those is because it just makes sense to give them practice with what they've been taught so they can apply it. And even when kids are moving out of decodable text into more authentic literature for their free reading, it still makes sense to include decodable text in their phonics lesson so they can practice that skill. The challenge is that we don't have a lot of specifics from research about exactly how decodable it should be. Like, does it have to be 100%? Like, research doesn't say that. In fact, research seems to say that kids benefit from a variety of texts, reading material, even as beginners. And that is hard to figure out because we're pretty sure from experience, we can say that predictable text is not the right choice, right? Because that's teaching bad habits. It's not letting them apply their phonics patterns. How much text can they handle that's not decodable on their own? I think that's the hard part. It's possible that as teachers, we can do some shared reading of more complex texts. But in general, teachers aligned with a structural literacy approach believe that we want to keep their reading material to mostly decodable at the beginning stages. But some people might say, oh, we should keep them decodable. Why not keep them in decodable? It may just make sense. They can easily decode those words, but we do not want to, because phonics only gets us so far with a word, right? Like, we know that the schwa is the most common vowel sound in the English language. Just take a word like cactus. If they would sound that out perfectly, it would be cactus. Well, that's using their phonics, but that's not how you say it. So we also have to use something called set for variability, where we say it and then we adjust it to a word that's in our oral language. With a decodable book, there may not be a lot of opportunities for that. And so we need to give them lots of practice doing that. There's also something called statistical learning where, and I can't speak to the research on this because I'm not sure about it, but I know Marnie Ginsburg of Reading Simplified talks about this a lot. But it's the idea that the more you see particular patterns, the more you kind of pick them up without necessarily being taught them. Because there's so many graphemes, so many spellings for different sounds that we can't possibly teach them all. And there's a something called the self-teaching hypothesis by David Scher. I think that was from the 80s. And I could be wrong with that, but he had talked about how at some point after kids know enough of the phonics code and what that is, I think it's different for every child, to be honest. They can start to apply that to words they haven't read before and start to figure out those phonics patterns they haven't been explicitly taught. So we know that those things are true, that we want to leave space for statistical learning, practice with set for variability, let the self-teaching hypothesis kick in, but where and when for each child is hard to say. So what I typically say is, if you have a student who is looking at you when they don't know the word, or looking at the picture and they don't seem to have any good strategy for figuring out those longer words, which would be decoding and set for variability, then they probably need to stay in decodable text. But some kids can, get a little foundation of phonics and read pretty well out of non-decodable text pretty early on. So I think, yeah, I wish it was straightforward. I have a blog post about this. It's probably called, if someone Googled when to move kids out of decodable text, the measured mom, I talk about this. And I also have links to other people who have thoughts on this as well. I think it's more of an art of teaching thing. And just to remember that decodable text are training wheels. They're not a permanent thing. And many people would agree that if kids are getting good phonics instruction, by the middle or end of first grade, they're moving out of decodable text for their independent reading.
I think that that whole idea of statistical learning and just what we often refer to in the therapy world as carryover, it's almost an example of one of those ideas that is true, but people over apply it. For example, they assume, well, if kids are going to learn through exposure, then we don't have to teach them any phonics. It's almost like it's true, but only to a certain extent. We still need to give them explicit instruction. And no, you don't need to give them explicit instruction for every skill that they're going to need to learn in their lives, but we need to give them some, and it needs to be specific and systematic. Yeah, I think that I always am finding that balance with the way that I advise some of the therapists that I'm working with, because they're like, well, I want a hierarchy. And I'm like, you do need a hierarchy, but sometimes they're so overwhelmed and want the whole thing. They want to see the whole staircase, and you can't always give it to them. So I can certainly relate to that challenge of when is enough. But I think the main thing is that when you have a student who is looking in all the places they're not supposed to be looking to figure out how to decode a word, that's a key sign that they need to bolster some of those skills. I'm wondering too, so as you were saying how sometimes people are doing this hybrid, they're kind of doing balanced literacy, but they're doing a little bit of phonics and it's not working. If that makes people think, oh, well, I guess phonics doesn't work, it's not working. So maybe if that's part of the reason why there's this, oh, it's just a pendulum swing. So
yeah, there's something to be said for that. So understanding, and that's why teacher knowledge is so important, like understanding that the point of phonics instruction is to apply it in decoding, right? So you could tell kids phonics rules all day long and tell them what all these letters sounds say, but if they're not applying it through reading and writing, then you're kind of wasting your time.
Mm-hmm. That's that. I like it where one of the things that I talk about with some of the SLPs and other professionals is there's this whole idea of contextualized learning. You need to learn through context and real experiences. But where people get stuck with that is that we have these super structured things, and they're almost sometimes referred to as splinter skills, where it's just drill and kill, and you're just drilling. And then you have this huge jump to this situation where they have to apply all these skills at once. And then there's this void in between. And I see decodable text as a way to come a little bit over to more contextualized, but still structured enough that we can have some scaffolding with that application, so that when we get to the point that we are doing those authentic texts, or if kids are just out in their community and they have to read a sign,
right,
and they have to remember to apply some of those skills, that we have to have something that is It's not fully decontextualized, but it's not as contextualized as these other things over here, where there needs to be that balance.
I'm going to take a quick break here to talk about the School of Clinical Leadership and Language Therapy Advanced Foundations. As you're listening to the conversation, you're probably starting to realize how important it is for professionals to work on building their own skill sets for how they work directly with students, as well as understanding how systems work and putting strategic plans in place for working with the whole team. Because you can make a big impact with direct intervention, but you can make an even bigger impact if you take it a step further and also think about leadership and advocacy. So I help you do both things in the School of Clinical Leadership and Language Therapy Advanced Foundations. In Language Therapy Advanced Foundations, I help SLPs and other professionals working on language create a system for language therapy so they can walk into sessions confident that they're giving kids the skills that they need to succeed and that they're building those foundational language skills that support high-level comprehension and literacy. To learn more about that program, you can go to drkarenspeech.com/language therapy. Now, many of my Language Therapy Advanced Foundation students, once they start to get confident in their protocol, realize that they need to be collaborating with their teams. So that's really the next step. And many of them realize that they should be working on executive functioning as well. Now, there's plenty of executive functioning work embedded into Language Therapy Advanced Foundations because work on metacognition is so important to effective language intervention. But we also have to think about what the entire team is doing because students need support when they leave your room. And part of that is ensuring the right scaffolding is in place across the environments that students are in. And when we think about executive functioning, we have to think about more than just literacy and academics. We also have to think about how students self-regulate, how they interact socially, and how they handle those unstructured situations during their school day, as well as outside of their school day. And you need a framework for navigating all of that because now, once we move beyond thinking about direct intervention, we're thinking about multiple service delivery models. And you need a framework for making that happen. I help you do that in the School of Clinical Leadership, my program that helps related service providers develop a plan for putting executive functioning support in place in collaboration with their school teams. You can learn more about the School of Clinical Leadership at drkarendudek-brannan.com/clinical leadership. As part of the Reading is Fundamental series, you can get 25% off either program, or actually both programs if you wanted to join both, between September 15th and October 15th. Just enter coupon code RIF25 on the checkout page when you're signing up to get this special rate.
One of the things that you had said about the three cueing, which I think is an important distinction to make because I do a lot with vocabulary and syntax and using context cues to improve your vocabulary, that is very different from using a context cue to understand or try to decode a word. That yes, eventually we want kids to be using context to understand vocabulary words. Yes, we need to explicitly teach syntax, but we also need to teach them to decode words. It's not a method for replacing those phonics or that attention to morphology and orthography. So that's an important distinction.
And just to that is a very good point. And we can use context to confirm a word, right? So if I'm reading and I'm saying cactus, that doesn't make sense, but I know the cactus is in the desert. Oh, that's a cactus, right? So the context absolutely is important, but it's not what we use to identify the word. We get as far as we can with phonics, and then we can use context to confirm it.
And I think even the word cactus, like you said, where there's a little bit of variability, if you're only using phonics, you're going to pronounce it wrong. But if you have to use a little bit of both and integrate all of those linguistic skills. So let's talk about the topic of the joy of reading, because I know that it sounded like you had a few thoughts on that. So yeah, let's go that way.
So I'm not really sure, but back in the 1800s when Horace Mann, who was I think a superintendent or something like that in I think it was Boston schools. He called phonics instruction soulless, drain, like blood sucking. I don't know. He had some interesting words about it. And I think because he was probably watching the drill and kill type stuff that we're trying to avoid, right? Where it's just drill, 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 and then like no joyful application, right? And then I think that that's where whole language came in too. Like teachers had this, or Ken Goodman and Frank Smith, people who founded whole language, had this idea that, teaching phonics skills in isolation was boring and wasn't going to be joyful for kids. And what we really want is to get them into literature, because as adults, that's where we find joy, right? In actually reading texts. And so that was for me too. I think if you talk to balanced literacy teachers, they will often say, my goal is to get all my students to love reading. That's what I said. And here, what I had to finally come to grips with is you can't teach love. You can't teach kids to love reading. Margaret Goldberg has a really good piece on this in her Right to Read project. I think it's called "We Can't Teach Love, but We Can Teach Reading." And what we have to realize is that the joy comes from being able to do the reading. And I think it's fair to say that I think it's possible for people to go back over, to overcorrect and do really rigid phonics exercises without putting joy in there. But I also know that there's teachers who are very active and engaging, and kids love their phonics lessons. Jean Shaw, she wrote a book called Learning to Read the Great Debate, and it was published in 1967. Then she published a couple more editions. And she visited like 300 classrooms. She watched teachers teach. She analyzed lots of studies to figure out what was the better beginning approach, this meaning-based approach, like with balanced literacy type stuff, whole language, or the code first, where we focus on the code. And she found the code first approach was superior, but she also found that the phonics lessons, whether or not the students were engaged, was based on the teacher's teaching, like the environment created by the teacher, not by it being phonics, but by what the teacher did. So when teachers understand the importance of phonics and they remember the art of teaching, there's so many things you could talk about there. Phonics instruction doesn't have to be boring at all, especially also when teachers differentiate based on need, right? So if they know how to help the kids who need extra support and challenge the others, it doesn't have to be boring at all. But I was definitely caught up in that. That was a big concern for me. And that was why I was very against heavy use of decodable text for a long time, because I thought, oh, these books are boring. Like the kids aren't going to like them. They're not going to like reading. And first of all, if anyone says that now, we don't really have a leg to stand on anymore, because so many great decodable stories have come out in the last even 10 years, Back when I was first teaching, there really weren't very many. So there was something to be said for that. But when kids are pulling the words off the page themselves, that's where the joy comes in. I had a friend who sent me a text of her daughter. She's homeschooling for kindergarten, and she was just sounding out a list of words, actually. She was on sand. And sand. Sand! Like she was so excited because she realized, oh, I figured out this is a word and I know the word. And she was just reading a word list. So when we teachers get that the joy comes from actually pulling the word off by sounding it out, and we're excited, I think there's joy for the students too.
That's a great example, because a word list is one of those things where, oh, worksheets are so boring. And I'm not a huge worksheet person unless it makes sense. But I mean, you don't even need a word list. You can have a dry erase board and some markers.
Exactly.
But you have the word list, and you can have the students be writing it on the board, and they think that's great when they get to write something or be the one to lead the class or whatever it is. And I think that that's a great point, that there is, and maybe another thing where people feel, and this could be people in education, where they feel like, okay, if we have more accountability, more top-down mandates and things like that, you're taking away the autonomy, you're taking away the freedom to be able to teach the way that you want. But all we're doing is streamlining this one thing of how we are approaching reading, but you have all these other variables and all this flexibility with how you choose to run your classroom, that there's a lot of room for autonomy and flexibility, and for you to have the art as opposed to just the science of teaching. And this would apply to therapy as well.
I want to say one thing there too. I think I'm totally with you on that, because I didn't like anyone taking away my autonomy. That was something I prized as a teacher. And I mean, it was good in some ways, but when I look back, it would have been much better to have more someone kind of having expectations for me because I thought what I was doing was right. But looking back, some of what I was doing was not right. But also to your point about, the phonics, I know we're talking a lot about phonics because that's the big thing that needs a correction, but the science of reading is so much more, right? It's about word recognition. It's about language comprehension, all the things that you talk about, syntax, semantics, vocabulary. We're narrowing in on that because to me, that's the biggest difference between balanced and structured literacy. But we don't have to be afraid of giving a structured, systematic approach or to feel like something's being taken away from us. We have to remember that we're giving something to our students, and that brings joy to everyone.
I agree. Have you heard, or well, not heard, but seen Dr. Pamela Snow wrote an article about in teaching, we need less autonomy, not more. I just wonder
Yes.
what kind of reaction she got to that article. I had her on the podcast shortly after she wrote it, and we just touched on it a little bit at the end, but that's a controversial opinion now because and maybe not maybe just in the groups that I'm in where everyone is pushing for, again, bring back the joy, bring back the, let teachers do their jobs and let them have
Mm,
have decision making ability, which they should do that. But I think part of it, and this is another thing that came up on a previous episode with the hosts Mary and Shannon from the Reading Teachers Lounge.
oh,
I
yes.
think I think you know them as well, where Mary, yeah, it was Mary who brought up a situation where it was getting litigious and the parent said, "Hey, you're not helping my child. What are you going to do for this teacher who clearly, like, you need to do some training for this teacher?" I think it's the same for teachers. How can you have the joy if you feel like you don't know what you're doing? And if you have students struggling and you're having to go to your job every day and you're looking and saying, "Hey, I'm leaving all these students behind." How are you going to feel excited about your job if that's what's happening? And I know I get, you get the emails from people who they don't want to post it on social media, but they'll share it privately like, "Hey, I'm drowning here and I need help," and they're not really sure. So I think that the joy in helping teachers feel excited about their jobs and therapists as well, that it's part of joy comes with feeling like you have the skills and developing that confidence.
Exactly. And I think just like giving kids the tools to decode words and the vocabulary to be able to understand those words, teachers need the knowledge to be able to figure out what's wrong. I think for me, I can speak for myself personally and for other people I've talked to. So often in the balanced literacy world, when we don't know why a student isn't learning, we blame the student. Well, their parents aren't reading enough to them, or they're not having enough experiences, and so that's why. And so this child just isn't going to reach the level as same as the other kids, without realizing that we have the ability to raise reading outcomes for our students using the data that we've collected and what we know about how reading works. But when you lack that knowledge, you're at a loss. And I agree, that's not fun. It's not a fun place to be. It's not fun to be blaming kids and blaming parents. So the answer really comes in equipping teachers with the knowledge so that they understand why we're doing all these things.
Yeah, absolutely. So I had one more question I thought would be kind of an interesting thing to wrap up with. There is the again, so there's the we're taking away the joy debate, and it's a pendulum swing and all of that. And so I know we've gotten into all of those topics, but the idea of when do we start teaching reading and what does that look for the early years? Because the joy debate comes in there because we know that we learn through play and it's very important for cognitive development. And so there's this question about when do we bring in some of those more structured approaches, especially in the preschool, kindergarten years, because I know that a lot of people feel like we are, again, going into drill and kill and making preschoolers do worksheets and things like that. So how should that look when you're thinking about those early years and making sure that by the end of early elementary school, kids have those solid skills so that they can continue to be successful in their education?
It's a great question, and it's a huge debate. I know One of my biggest pet peeves is when someone's in a Facebook group and says, my 5-year-old can't remember their letter names. What do I do? And someone says, he's 5, let him play. When actually, we know that that's kind of a sign that we need to be, it could be a warning sign. So we need to be figuring this out. Another thing I want to address quickly is that I know people often say, well, in Finland, they don't teach kids to read till they're 7. So why do
Oh
we have to
yeah,
start so
the F
early?
word.
Yeah. One thing to say about that, Finnish is a very shallow, has a very shallow orthography. It's very consistent, just like Spanish in terms of letter sounds matching up to letters. English is not. English has a deep orthography. So it makes sense, logical sense, that we need more time to teach it and learn to spell it, which means, by my view, we should start sooner. Now, what's appropriate reading instruction in the primary grades? I had a podcast episode with now my brain for Susan Newman, which I would, if I would link to that in your show notes. But we talked about what does the research say about teaching reading in preschool. She is a wealth of knowledge. She's a professor, author, practitioner, has lots of experience in this. And we talked about that play-based versus playful learning. And she, if I have this right, play-based, I'm pretty sure is what is not what she would recommend. So that would be like, well, we just play and then we pick things up as we play. And if we learn it, we learn it. If we don't, we don't, but we have fun. And playful learning, the teacher does have some objectives, but they're teaching those skills in an appropriate way for the age. So it's not that learning the alphabet is developmentally inappropriate for a preschooler. It's that the ways you teach it could be developmentally inappropriate, right? So if you're doing, having them sit for half an hour and you're talking at them, that's not developmentally appropriate. But does that mean you can't find other ways to teach letters and sounds? No. In fact, phonemic awareness, that awareness that words are broken into sounds and is a very, very important early literacy skill, the National Reading Panel found the greatest effect size for teaching that in preschool. So we don't want to put things off because we're afraid that then our learning isn't going to be playful. But we need to have in mind what are the things I want to teach and think of appropriate ways to do that. And there's a book. This book I have, it's actually an older book, but it's called Learning to Read and Write, and it's by Susan Newman and some other people. And the subtitle is Developmentally Appropriate Practices for Young Children. So I'm actually working through this myself right now, but I would recommend that, even though it's an older book, for people who want to find appropriate ways to teach those things. And so much of that in the preschool room is through the environment you set up, but then the teacher actually getting in there and helping, right? So you might have a menu, like a little preschool station set up, but as students are starting to make letter-like forms or start to try to spell a word, the teacher's there to gradually or gently push them to the next level, So if a child has written, let's say, there's meat, someone ordered meat. So they put an M on the paper and you can say, all right, very good. You put for meat. What do you hear at the end of meat? Meat. If the child knows T, then they can write that, So, but that's teacher knowledge again, like understanding where I'm trying to get them to and what signs they're indicating that they're ready to move on. Another podcast episode I did was with Sonia Cabell, and she talked about that very thing, scaffolding writing experiences with preschoolers. So I was never a preschool classroom teacher. My kids did not go to preschool, so I taught them as preschoolers. I did teach them all to read before they went to school. And I've got to say, for people who get upset by that, it takes like 10 minutes a day, like not even. So it's not like we're taking over their childhood, but there are fun ways that we can teach letters and sounds. So that could be a whole other episode, but hopefully that helped a little bit.
It does. And I think what you just said at the end there is a really key distinction, that we're not talking about drilling with them all day. We're talking about taking an intentional 10, 15 minutes, and then there's plenty of time for play that there has many other benefits. But if you're not explicitly working on reading, then kids are not going to be literate. Even if there's other activities that kids can be doing, which are essential and have benefits for many other reasons. And it's really interesting. That could be a whole separate episode, as you said, because I know that sometimes in preschools, there's, sometimes the funding, it's, oh, you're not supposed to be teaching. The teachers kind of work it in, but they're not really supposed to be working on the orthographic code in preschool, or at least just what the guidelines are in their district. So that is a whole other episode. I'm glad you brought up Finland, because that's one of the most common, one of the common things or common arguments. Yeah. And I love that you brought up the complexity of the language, because I don't see that one being mentioned a lot. It's, oh, well, the culture is different, or people bring up other things besides that. But I think that looking at the language specifically and saying, oh, well, they're waiting and kids catch on. Well, you're comparing apples to oranges because you're talking about different languages. So I think that's a really important point that doesn't get brought up enough. So
another thing I don't want to miss on saying is that, that explicit teaching of a preschooler in a playful way, like 10, 15 minutes a day, not even every day. I certainly didn't, is in addition to all the wonderful reading aloud you're doing to your kids, which is so much research support. And I'm sure too, the research behind dialogic reading, about actually talking with them about the story and asking questions. That is so important. And I'm sure you're of anyone know how valuable that is. But building vocabulary, giving them access to language structures they may not hear in spoken language. And that's just fun for everyone. That's not work. That's not, there's nothing you could say about that would say that that's not age appropriate. So it's much more than this intentional teaching of the code. There's so many other things, and talking with our preschoolers, right? And letting them make choices, and there's just so much to it. That explicit teaching of reading is just a teeny tiny part of your day.
I think that sometimes when people say, oh, we're pushing kids to read too early, we're focusing on this one little sliver that's actually a very small part of it, and we're doing all these other things that are, as you said, quite playful and enjoyable, but not necessarily the same thing as play-based, which in many contexts is the appropriate thing to be doing. But context is everything. So, well, you've linked, or you've shared a lot of things that I'm definitely going to be linking to. So I'll be going back through and making sure that we link to all the things that you mentioned, like some of the past podcast episodes and books that you've mentioned, including your book. But where can people go to learn more about you and connect with you?
Yes, thank you. So my podcast is where I put most of my content out these days. I do blog series occasionally, so they can certainly visit my website. If they're a teacher, primarily primary teachers, the website has over 700 free resources, including decodable books and other resources. But if they want to learn more just about the science and what experts have to say, my podcast is a good place to go, Triple R Teaching. And I did just publish my book, Reach All Readers, which is really primarily for K to third grade teachers who want to understand what research says and know how to apply it for students. And so it's also good for administrators and anyone else, because we know that the classroom teacher is super important, but so is their principal and their superintendent. Like, everyone needs to understand this to know where to go next. So it can be purchased anywhere. And then in the fall of 2024, I'm going to be sharing an online course using that book as a textbook, and we'll get deeper into the things I mentioned in the course. And it does have about 40 to 50 video snapshots also of me demonstrating some of the things in the book.
Great. Well, we'll link to all those things. Thank you so much for being here with me today.
Thanks so much, Karen.
Thank you so much for listening. Be sure to check the show notes for all of the links that were mentioned in this episode and where you can go to connect with our amazing guest. In this episode, I mentioned the School of Clinical Leadership, my program that helps related service providers develop a strategic plan for putting executive functioning support in place in collaboration with their school teams. You can learn more about that program at drkarendudek-brannan.com/clinical leadership. And I also mentioned Language Therapy Advanced Foundations, my program that helps SLPs create a system for language therapy. You can learn more about that program at drkarenspeech.com/language therapy. You can get 25% off either the School of Clinical Leadership or Language Therapy Advanced Foundations as part of the Reading as Fundamental series when you join either program, or actually you could join both programs if you want to, between September 15th and October 15th. All you need to do to get 25% off of either program or both programs is enter coupon code RIF25 on the checkout page when you sign up. Here's what you can do right now to support the Reading is Fundamental campaign and this special series that we're doing on De facto leaders. First, you can go to Apple or Spotify or any other directory you use for podcasts and subscribe to the De facto Leaders podcast. Once you listen to an episode or two, leave me a rating and review because that helps get my show into the hands of people who need the information. Finally, if you have a colleague or friend who needs to learn more about the research surrounding language and literacy, or you want to spread the word about practices and ideas you'd like to see in your school, community, or state, then tell them about De facto Leaders so they can listen to all of the episodes in this special series. As always, thank you so much for listening, and I will see you next time.